In the spring of 1842, the cotton fields of southern Georgia shimmered beneath a relentless sun. The land stretched for miles, blanketed in white, a symbol of wealth, power, and control. At the center of that empire stood Whitfield Manor, a towering plantation house with gleaming pillars and a reputation that reached far beyond county lines. Inside that house lived a woman who refused to be broken by tragedy. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. When her husband, Thomas Whitfield, died unexpectedly from a sudden fever, most people expected the plantation to crumble. In the South of that era, plantations were almost always passed down to sons or male relatives. But Eleanor shocked the county by claiming full control of the estate herself. She inherited the massive property, its wealth, and over 200 enslaved workers who kept the plantation running. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Some doubted her strength. Others feared her ambition. But Eleanor Whitfield didn't care about their approval. She believed the Whitfield name was destined to dominate the region for generations. To her, this wasn't just about survival, it was about legacy. Every evening, Eleanor sat alone in her late husband's study, surrounded by dusty ledgers and fading portraits. On the wall hung a painting of her 5 daughters, Mary, Louise, Clara, Evelyn, and Rose. Each of them carried the elegance and refinement their mother valued deeply. Yet when Eleanor stared at that portrait, something unsettled her. She believed her daughters carried beauty, but not enough power. Eleanor had grown obsessed with the idea that her family needed to become stronger, more dominant, and impossible to challenge. The South was changing, tensions were rising, and powerful families were beginning to lose control over the future they once took for granted. She refused to let the Whitfield dynasty fade into history. Meanwhile, life on the plantation moved with mechanical precision. Workers labored from sunrise to sunset under strict supervision. Overseers barked orders while wagons carried harvested cotton toward the gin house. From her balcony, Eleanor watched everything with chilling patience. She rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority alone kept the entire estate under her control.
Before the story begins, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us. But among the hundreds of workers, one man began to capture her attention. His name was Josiah. He was taller than most men on the plantation, broad-shouldered and physically imposing. But it wasn't just his strength that made him stand out. Josiah carried himself with quiet composure. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice carried a calm confidence that unsettled even the overseers. Rumors spread that he had once lived in Virginia with a family before being sold away years earlier. The first time Eleanor noticed him, she watched from her balcony as he worked alongside the others in the brutal Georgia heat. Unlike the rest, he never rushed, never showed panic, and never collapsed under pressure. He moved with steady determination, like a man who had accepted suffering but refused to let it define him. Eleanor said nothing that day, but her gaze followed him longer than anyone realized. Within weeks, strange changes began to happen. Josiah was reassigned to work closer to the main house. His workload shifted from the fields to maintenance and repairs around the mansion. Officially, Eleanor claimed he was simply reliable and trustworthy. Unofficially, the plantation began to buzz with uneasy whispers. The house servants noticed how often Eleanor asked about him. Overseers grew uncomfortable with how frequently she summoned him for small, unnecessary tasks. Even her daughters started noticing their mother's growing fixation, though none of them understood what it meant. Late one night, Eleanor stood in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at her reflection under candlelight. Time had begun to carve faint lines across her once flawless face. Behind her, the plantation stretched into darkness, silent but alive. She turned toward her husband's portrait, hanging beside her vanity. "You gave me daughters," she whispered softly, "but this family needs more than that to survive." Her voice grew colder. "I will build a future they can never destroy." The next morning, Josiah was summoned to Whitfield Manor.
He stood in the grand entry hall, dust still clinging to his boots, sweat glistening across his shoulders after hours of work. Eleanor descended the staircase slowly, her posture regal and controlled. She circled him once, studying him like a general inspecting a soldier before battle. "From now on," she said calmly, "you will work directly under my supervision. The overseers will answer to me regarding your duties." Josiah nodded respectfully, but something behind his eyes shifted. He sensed danger, though he couldn't yet explain why. Outside, wind rolled through the cotton fields, bending the white plants like waves across the land. Inside the Whitfield Manor, Eleanor Whitfield watched Josiah leave the hall, her mind racing with plans no one else could imagine, because her obsession had just found its center, and what she intended to do next would ignite a secret so disturbing it would haunt the Whitfield name for generations. But Eleanor had no idea that her plan wouldn't just reshape her family's future, it would destroy it. By the summer of 1843, the Georgia heat pressed down on Whitfield Plantation like a heavy blanket. The air smelled of cotton dust and damp earth, and even the cicadas seemed louder than usual, screaming through the endless afternoons. But inside Whitfield Manor, the atmosphere felt far more suffocating than the weather outside. Eleanor Whitfield had begun reorganizing the household in ways that made both her daughters and her servants uneasy. Josiah's new duties kept him almost permanently inside or near the main house. One morning he repaired shutters. The next he was hauling firewood into the grand kitchen, despite it being the hottest season of the year. Some afternoons, Eleanor ordered him to polish railings or reinforce doors that needed no repair at all. Each task seemed random, yet carefully designed to keep him close. To outsiders, it looked like he had earned a rare position of trust, but to those living on the plantation, it felt like something darker was unfolding. One humid afternoon, Eleanor summoned Josiah to the veranda. She sat in a high-backed chair, slowly waving an ivory fan, while her daughters lingered behind lace curtains just inside the doorway. Their silhouettes barely moved, but their eyes followed every second of the interaction.
"You are Josiah," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and measured.
"Yes, ma'am," he replied, keeping his gaze lowered.
"I hear you are strong, dependable, and disciplined."
He nodded once, unsure how to respond. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her fan.
"You will now take instructions directly from me. I have plans that require someone capable of following orders without hesitation."
The words sounded like praise, but Josiah felt his chest tighten. He had spent years learning to recognize danger hidden behind polite Southern manners, and something about her tone felt less like opportunity and more like ownership. That night, he sat outside the small cabin he shared with 3 other workers. The humid air clung to his skin, while the sky glowed with distant lightning. He barely touched the bowl of stew sitting in his hands. An older house servant named Ruth approached quietly and lowered herself beside him. "They say Mistress Whitfield's taken a special interest in you," she whispered carefully. Josiah remained silent. Ruth studied his expression, her face tightening with worry. Son, I've been on plantations long enough to know when powerful people start noticing one man too closely, it rarely ends well. He finally spoke, his voice low. You know what she wants? Ruth shook her head slowly. I don't think anyone wants to know. Josiah stared into the darkness, memories creeping back from the life he lost years earlier, a wife he never saw again, a child whose face he barely remembered. He had survived by staying invisible, by never drawing attention. Now, for the first time in years, he felt trapped under a spotlight he couldn't escape. Inside Whitfield Manor, Eleanor was making preparations of her own. She began hosting formal dinners again, something she had avoided since her husband's death. The dining room was filled with candlelight, polished silverware, and forced conversation. But the strangest change came when she ordered Josiah to serve wine during one of these gatherings.
Her daughters sat stiffly at the table, their discomfort barely hidden. As Josiah moved between chairs, pouring glasses, Eleanor watched him carefully, studying every movement like she was evaluating livestock rather than a human being. Strong hands, she said suddenly, her voice slicing through the quiet room. Hands capable of shaping the future. Mary, her eldest daughter, froze mid-bite. Clara, the youngest, lowered her eyes, clearly frightened. No one spoke after that. Later that evening, Eleanor dismissed her daughters early, leaving Josiah alone in the hallway outside her study. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and she gestured for him to enter. The room smelled of candle wax and old leather books. Papers covered her desk, filled with handwritten notes and diagrams he couldn't fully see. You will remain loyal to this household, she said calmly, circling him again like she had the first day. Everything you are belongs to Whitfield Manor. Josiah lifted his head slightly, his voice steady but firm. My body may work here, ma'am, but no one owns who I am. The sentence hung in the air like a thunderclap. For the first time, Eleanor's composure cracked, her expression hardened, her eyes turning sharp with anger and fascination tangled together. Outside, storm clouds rolled across the Georgia sky, darkening the plantation fields. Inside the manor, the power struggle had quietly begun, and neither of them realized how quickly it would spiral beyond control. Because Eleanor's attention was no longer just curiosity, it was an obsession, and her next move would force her own daughters into a plan so disturbing it would shatter the fragile peace inside Whitfield Manor. Eleanor reveals her terrifying vision to her daughters, while Mary begins uncovering the horrifying truth behind her mother's obsession and secretly reaches out to Josiah, risking consequences that could cost them both their lives.
By early autumn of 1843, a strange silence had settled over Whitfield Manor. The cotton harvest continued, wagons still rolled across the dusty roads, and workers followed their routines under watchful supervision. Yet inside the main house, tension lingered in every hallway, thick enough to suffocate conversation. Eleanor Whitfield had grown colder with each passing week. Her daughters noticed it first. Their mother, once strict but composed, had become unpredictable. She rarely laughed. She rarely left her study. She spent long nights writing inside a black leather journal that never left her side. Even the servants whispered about how she now spoke to herself while walking through empty rooms. One humid afternoon, Eleanor ordered all 5 daughters to gather in the parlor. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust drifting slowly through the air. The girls sat together on a velvet sofa, their matching white dresses carefully arranged, though their nervous expressions betrayed their unease.
Josiah stood near the doorway, summoned but silent, his presence adding weight to the already tense atmosphere. Eleanor entered with deliberate grace, carrying her journal against her chest. She paused in front of them, studying each daughter as if measuring their worth. "My girls," she began, her tone almost affectionate, "everything I have done, every sacrifice I have made, has been for this family." Mary, the eldest, watched her carefully. "Mother, you've always protected us, but lately something feels different." Eleanor's lips tightened slightly, but she continued. "The Whitfield name must endure beyond this generation. The world is changing. Families like ours are becoming weaker because they refuse to evolve." Louise shifted nervously beside her sister. "What do you mean, evolve?" Eleanor turned slowly toward Josiah, her eyes sharp with purpose. "Strength must be cultivated, legacy must be secured, and survival requires difficult decisions." The room fell silent. The younger daughters exchanged frightened glances. Mary felt her stomach twist as realization crept closer, though she prayed she was wrong. "You five will carry this family forward. You will build a new chapter of Whitfield history, one that no outside influence can weaken." Mary stood up abruptly. "Mother, what are you saying?"
Eleanor opened her journal and flipped through several pages filled with neat handwriting and strange genealogical sketches. She placed it on the table where her daughters could see. "I have chosen a path that guarantees our dominance for generations," she said calmly. "Josiah represents strength, resilience, and endurance, traits this family must possess to survive what is coming." The words landed like a physical blow. Clara gasped quietly. Evelyn covered her mouth in horror. Louise looked ready to cry. Mary stepped forward, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You cannot be serious," she said. "You're talking about forcing us into something monstrous." Eleanor's expression hardened instantly. "I am talking about preserving our bloodline and ensuring our future." Josiah remained frozen near the doorway, his jaw clenched tightly. He had feared this moment, but hearing it spoken aloud filled him with rage and helplessness tangled together. Mary turned toward him, her eyes filled with apology and fear. Then she faced her mother again. "This isn't legacy," she said quietly. "This is madness." Eleanor slammed her journal shut, the sound echoing through the parlor. "You speak like a child who doesn't understand the cost of survival," she snapped. "History rewards families who are willing to do what others are too weak to attempt." The younger daughters began crying softly. The room felt smaller, suffocating under Eleanor's unshakable conviction. That evening, Mary sat alone in her bedroom, staring out at the fading sunset over the fields. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, mixing with fear for her sisters and guilt toward Josiah. She knew obedience would destroy them, but defiance could bring consequences just as deadly. As darkness settled across the plantation, Mary quietly slipped from her room. She moved through shadowed hallways, avoiding creaking floorboards, until she reached the back courtyard, where Josiah often worked after sundown. He stood near the well, washing dirt from his hands beneath the lantern light. "Josiah," she whispered. He turned slowly, surprise flickering across his face.
"My mother. She's losing herself," Mary said, her voice trembling. "And if we don't stop her, she will destroy every life inside this house." Josiah stared at her, his expression heavy with truth he had already accepted. "She won't stop," he said quietly. "Not unless someone makes her." A distant thunderclap rolled across the horizon as storm clouds gathered once again over Whitfield Plantation. And for the first time, Mary realized that saving her family might mean betraying her own mother. Eleanor begins enforcing her terrifying plan, tightening control over her daughters, while Josiah secretly prepares to resist, and Mary makes a dangerous decision that could spark rebellion inside Whitfield Manor. By late autumn, Whitfield Manor no longer felt like a family home. It had transformed into something colder, quieter, and far more suffocating. The towering white pillars still stood proudly against the Georgia sky, but inside those walls, fear had replaced comfort. Eleanor Whitfield had begun enforcing new rules that reshaped daily life for everyone under her roof. Her daughters were no longer allowed to leave the house without her permission. Walks through the gardens stopped entirely. Visits to neighboring estates vanished. Even conversations among the sisters became monitored, as Eleanor insisted they spend most of their time together under her direct supervision. She claimed she was protecting them. In reality, she was isolating them. Servants were ordered to report unusual behavior immediately. Doors that once remained open were now locked at night. Eleanor positioned herself as the center of every decision, every movement, every breath inside Whitfield Manor. And Josiah remained trapped in the middle of it all. His responsibilities expanded rapidly. Eleanor demanded he remained close to the house at all times. He repaired shutters, reinforced staircases, and worked late into the evening under her constant watch. The plantation workers began noticing his absence from the fields, and rumors spread faster than wildfire across the property.
One evening, Eleanor summoned her daughters to the fitting room where a seamstress waited nervously beside bolts of white fabric. The room smelled of starch and fresh linen as the girls stood in silence. "You will each be measured for new gowns," Eleanor instructed calmly. "They will match perfectly." Louise hesitated. "Mother, what are they for?" Eleanor adjusted a piece of fabric between her fingers. "For a family portrait, one that represents our future." Mary studied her mother's expression carefully. She recognized that tone. It was the same voice Eleanor used whenever she was hiding something dangerous beneath elegant words. The younger sisters allowed themselves to be measured, though their trembling hands betrayed their fear. Mary, however, stepped forward cautiously. "You're planning something soon, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Eleanor met her gaze without hesitation. "Everything I do is for this family's survival." That night, Mary barely slept. The walls of her room felt like a cage closing around her. She replayed every moment of the parlor conversation, every glance her mother directed toward Josiah, and every terrified look shared between her sisters. By morning, Mary made a decision that terrified her more than obedience ever could. She began watching her mother. Over the next several days, Mary noticed Eleanor spending hours writing in her journal, whispering calculations and family lineage records while candles burned low into the night. She also observed how Eleanor increasingly separated the daughters, keeping them busy with lessons, embroidery, or supervised reading to prevent them from speaking privately. Meanwhile, Josiah felt the pressure tightening around him. One afternoon, while repairing a damaged roof near the parlor balcony, he noticed Eleanor and Mary arguing quietly below. Their voices were low, but the tension was unmistakable. He caught fragments of Mary's protest and Eleanor's icy warnings, enough to confirm what he already feared.
Later that evening, as darkness settled across the estate, Mary slipped outside once again. She found Josiah stacking firewood behind the kitchen. "She's accelerating whatever she's planning," Mary whispered urgently. "She's preparing something soon. I can feel it." Josiah wiped sweat from his brow, his expression grim.
Your mother has power here. If she decides to move forward, nobody on this plantation will stop her willingly." Mary swallowed hard. "Then we can't rely on anyone else." He studied her carefully, realizing the weight of what she was suggesting. "You're talking about defying your own mother," he said. Mary's voice shook, but her eyes stayed steady. "I'm talking about saving my sisters and saving you." A strong gust of wind rattled the nearby shutters, sending fallen leaves swirling across the courtyard. The air felt charged, like the plantation itself sensed an approaching storm. Josiah glanced toward the main house, where candlelight flickered through Eleanor's study window. "If we move against her," he said slowly, "there's no turning back." Mary nodded, fear flashing across her face. "I know," she whispered. Inside Whitfield Manor, Eleanor continued writing in her journal, her pen gliding smoothly across the page, as if recording destiny itself. Outside, two unlikely allies stood in the shadows, quietly preparing for resistance neither of them fully understood. Because Eleanor Whitfield wasn't just planning to control her daughters anymore. She was preparing to seal their fate permanently. Eleanor announces the night of her twisted ceremony, forcing her daughters into obedience, while Mary and Josiah secretly begin planning a desperate escape, one that could end in freedom or bloodshed. Winter approached Georgia slowly, but the chill had already settled inside Whitfield Manor long before the first frost touched the fields. The once lively plantation now felt heavy with dread, as if every hallway and staircase carried secrets too dangerous to speak aloud.
Eleanor Whitfield had grown increasingly focused, moving through the house with unsettling determination. Her daughters noticed how she no longer entertained guests, no longer attended church, and rarely spoke about anything unrelated to the family's future. Her entire existence had narrowed into a single purpose, and soon she decided it was time to reveal it completely. One evening, Eleanor summoned the entire household staff along with her daughters to the main parlor. Candles lined the walls, casting long shadows that danced across polished floors. Thick velvet curtains blocked the outside world, sealing the room in suffocating privacy. Josiah stood near the grand staircase, uncertain why he had been called, but already fearing the answer. Eleanor entered wearing a dark silk gown, her posture perfectly rigid. In her hands rested the black leather journal she guarded like sacred scripture. She placed it on a small table beside her before turning toward her daughters, who sat close together, visibly shaken. "Tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter for our family," Eleanor announced calmly. Louise's hands trembled in her lap. Clara leaned closer to Evelyn, searching for comfort. Mary remained standing, her expression tense but defiant. Eleanor opened her journal slowly. "For generations, powerful families have survived by making difficult choices. Weakness destroys legacy. Strength ensures survival." Mary stepped forward cautiously. "Mother, please listen to yourself. You're frightening everyone." Eleanor ignored her interruption. "I have selected a path that will guarantee our bloodline remains unchallenged. Each of you will play your part in securing Whitfield history." The room grew deathly silent. She turned toward Josiah, her gaze sharp and possessive. "He has been chosen to strengthen this family's future." The younger daughters gasped softly. Louise burst into quiet tears. Clara buried her face against Evelyn's shoulder. Mary's heart pounded so loudly she felt certain everyone could hear it. "You cannot force this," Mary said firmly. "This is cruel and completely wrong." Eleanor's voice hardened instantly. Everything great requires sacrifice. Josiah finally stepped forward, his voice controlled but heavy with restrained anger. "Ma'am, I won't be part of something like this."
Eleanor turned toward him slowly, her expression turning icy. "You do not get to decide that." The tension snapped like a breaking rope. Eleanor signaled to two overseers standing near the doorway. They stepped forward slightly, reminding everyone in the room of the power she still commanded across the plantation. "This ceremony will take place in 3 nights," Eleanor continued, her voice calm and unwavering. "Preparations will begin immediately." The words struck like thunder. Mary's breath caught as panic surged through her chest. 3 nights, that was all the time she had left to save her sisters and Josiah. Later that night, Mary slipped out of the manor once again, her heart racing as she searched the dark courtyard. She found Josiah near the barn, quietly saddling one of the horses under dim lantern light. "You heard her," Mary whispered urgently. "We don't have time anymore." Josiah nodded grimly. "If we're leaving, it has to be soon. Once that ceremony begins, escape won't be possible." Mary swallowed hard. "My sisters won't survive this. Neither will you." He studied her carefully, recognizing the desperation behind her fear. The plantation guards the roads at night, and the overseer releases tracking dogs if anyone disappears. Mary clenched her fists, her voice trembling but determined. "Then we don't run blindly, we plan carefully." A cold wind swept through the barn, rattling loose boards and scattering straw across the floor. Both of them glanced toward Whitfield Manor, where Eleanor's study window glowed with candlelight deep into the night. Inside, she continued writing inside her journal, documenting what she believed would become her family's eternal triumph. Outside, Mary and Josiah began mapping a desperate escape that would require perfect timing, flawless secrecy, and unimaginable courage. Because if they failed, Whitfield Manor wouldn't just imprison them, it would destroy them. The night of escape begins as Mary risks freeing her sisters while Josiah secretly gathers allies among the workers. But Eleanor's growing paranoia leads her to set a trap that could end their rebellion before it even starts.
The final days before Eleanor Whitfield's planned ceremony unfolded under an eerie calm. The cotton fields remained active, wagons rolled steadily toward the storage barns, and workers continued their routines as if nothing unusual was happening. But beneath that surface, tension spread quietly across Whitfield Plantation like a gathering storm no one could escape. Eleanor had grown suspicious. She moved through the manor with heightened alertness, watching her daughters more closely than ever. Servants noticed how she began appearing unexpectedly in hallways, listening outside closed doors, and questioning anyone who lingered too long in conversation. The house felt less like a home and more like a fortress preparing for battle. Mary recognized the change immediately. She had started secretly speaking to her sisters during brief moments when Eleanor's attention shifted elsewhere. Late at night, she whispered reassurances through bedroom doors, trying to prepare them for a plan she wasn't fully certain would succeed. Louise cried quietly each time Mary explained they might have to leave everything behind. Clara and Evelyn listened in terrified silence, struggling to understand how their mother had become someone they barely recognized. Meanwhile, Josiah began moving carefully among the workers. He avoided drawing attention, choosing moments when overseers were distracted or focused on field production. In hushed conversations near the tool sheds and water wells, he spoke to a handful of trusted workers about leaving the plantation. Most refused immediately, fear locking them into survival habits they had followed for years, but a few listened, their expressions dark with silent agreement. One evening, Josiah met with Ruth behind the smokehouse, hidden from the main yard's view. "She's tightening control," he said quietly. "If anyone plans to run, it has to be soon." Ruth nodded slowly, her weathered hands gripping her apron. "I've seen masters lose their sense before, but your mistress is different. She believes she's chosen for something sacred. That kind of belief makes people dangerous." Josiah glanced toward the manor, candlelight flickering through Eleanor's study window. "We're leaving tomorrow night. Mary and her sisters, they'll try to meet us near the back stables." Ruth's expression softened with sadness. "Then you better pray she doesn't already suspect." Inside Whitfield Manor, Eleanor sat alone at her desk, reviewing pages of her journal filled with calculations, dates, and ceremonial preparations. Yet her pen paused repeatedly as unease crept into her thoughts. She had begun noticing small irregularities, servants avoiding eye contact, her daughters appearing unusually exhausted, and Josiah moving through the house with cautious precision. She rang a small bell beside her desk. Within minutes, the plantation overseer entered the study, removing his hat respectfully. "I want night patrols doubled," Eleanor said coldly, "and release the hounds if anyone approaches the outer gates after dark. I won't tolerate disobedience at this stage." The overseer hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, ma'am." By midnight, guards quietly increased their patrol routes across the plantation. Lantern lights drifted through the fields like wandering stars, and distant barking from restless dogs echoed through the humid Georgia night. Mary heard the dogs first. She stood frozen beside her bedroom window, her heart sinking as she watched new lanterns moving along the property's borders. Panic tightened her chest. Her mother wasn't just suspicious anymore. She was preparing for betrayal. Later that night, Mary slipped downstairs to meet Josiah near the storage shed as planned. He stepped from the shadows, immediately reading the fear in her eyes. "She's doubled the guards," Mary whispered urgently, "and the dogs are already restless." Josiah's jaw tightened as he processed the information. "That means she's expecting someone to run." Mary grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "Do we still try?" He looked toward the manor, its towering silhouette glowing faintly against storm clouds rolling across the horizon. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance as wind began sweeping across the cotton fields, bending the plants in restless waves. The plantation felt alive with tension, as if every tree and fence post sensed the coming chaos. Inside her study, Eleanor closed her journal and stared out her window toward the darkened fields, her instincts sharpening with certainty. She didn't know exactly who planned to betray her, but she was ready to stop them.
The escape attempt begins under a violent storm as Mary tries to free her sisters and Josiah leads a daring breakout. But Eleanor unleashes her guards and hunting dogs, triggering a chase that could end in deadly confrontation. The night chosen for escape arrived beneath a sky that looked ready to collapse. Heavy storm clouds swallowed the moon, and violent winds tore through the Georgia countryside, rattling shutters and bending cotton stalks nearly flat. For most of Whitfield Plantation, the storm felt like another miserable southern downpour. For Mary and Josiah, it was their only chance at freedom. Inside Whitfield Manor, Eleanor Whitfield paced her study in restless silence. Rain slammed against tall windows, while candle flames flickered wildly across her desk. Her instinct screamed that something was about to happen, though she couldn't yet see the betrayal forming inside her own walls. Upstairs, Mary waited in her bedroom, fully dressed beneath a heavy cloak she had hidden for days.
Her heart pounded as thunder shook the house. She listened carefully for footsteps in the hallway before quietly slipping into Louise's room first. "It's time," Mary whispered urgently. Louise sat upright, panic flashing across her face. "Tonight? Already?" "We don't have another night," Mary replied, pulling her sister to her feet. They moved quickly, waking Clara, Evelyn, and Rose one by one. The younger girls trembled as Mary explained the plan again in hushed tones. They would sneak down the servants' staircase, cross the courtyard, and meet Josiah near the back stables, where 2 horses waited. From there, they would head toward the swamp trails Josiah believed could hide them. Fear clung to each sister like the storm outside, but none of them refused. Meanwhile, Josiah moved through the servant quarters, gathering 2 workers who had quietly agreed to help distract the guards. They nodded without speaking, knowing the risk meant brutal punishment or death if they were caught. The wind howled through loose boards as they slipped into the rain, vanishing into darkness to create noise near the far fields. Inside the manor, Mary guided her sisters down the narrow back staircase. Each creaking step made her breath catch. Lightning flashed through tall windows, briefly illuminating their terrified faces before plunging them back into shadow. When they reached the courtyard door, Mary slowly pushed it open. Rain instantly soaked their gowns, the cold water shocking against their skin. Across the yard, Josiah emerged beside the stables, a lantern barely visible beneath the storm's chaos. "You made it!" he shouted softly over the thunder. They ran toward him, mud splashing beneath their bare feet. Josiah quickly helped the youngest girls climb onto one horse while preparing the second for Mary and Louise. The plan was to travel together until reaching the swamp trails, where dense forest could hide their tracks. Just as they prepared to leave, a sudden sharp bark split the storm. The plantation dogs had caught their scent. Lantern lights flared near the main house as guards shouted over the wind. Mary's stomach dropped as she saw figures rushing toward them across the courtyard. "Go!" Josiah ordered, slapping the horses forward. The animals bolted into the rain, hooves pounding against soaked earth as the sisters clung tightly to the saddles. Behind them, shouting voices grew louder while dogs howled with terrifying excitement. Inside Whitfield Manor, Eleanor burst onto the veranda, her dark cloak whipping violently in the wind. Lightning flashed behind her, casting her silhouette across the yard as she watched the fleeing figures racing toward the plantation fields. "Traitors!" she screamed into the storm, her voice nearly swallowed by thunder. Guards mounted horses quickly, rifles slung across their shoulders as they followed the muddy trail left behind. The dogs surged ahead, their howls echoing through the soaked farmland. Mary clung to the saddle, rain blinding her vision as Josiah guided them toward the distant tree line. Every heartbeat felt like borrowed time. She could hear the dogs gaining ground, their snarls cutting through the storm like approaching death. "Faster!" cried Louise, clutching Clara tightly behind her. Josiah pushed the horses harder, aiming for the narrow forest path leading toward the swamp river. But the storm had turned the ground into thick, treacherous mud, slowing their escape more with every step. Behind them, rifle shots suddenly cracked through the rain. The chase had begun. The desperate pursuit reaches the flooded riverbanks as Josiah fights to protect the sisters. Mary faces a heartbreaking sacrifice, and Eleanor closes in for a final confrontation that will decide who survives the Whitfield curse. The storm worsened as Mary, her sisters, and Josiah pushed deeper into the wilderness beyond Whitfield Plantation. Rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the forest trails into slippery trenches of mud and roots. The horses struggled with every step, their breath heavy and strained, but slowing down meant certain capture. Behind them, the sound of barking dogs and shouting guards echoed through the trees, growing louder with every passing moment.
"Hold tight," Josiah shouted over the roar of thunder as he guided the lead horse toward the river trail he remembered from years of hauling timber through the swamps. Mary clutched the saddle with one hand while gripping Louise's arm with the other. She could feel her sister trembling violently behind her. Clara and Evelyn cried softly as they bounced across the uneven ground, their fear barely drowned out by the storm. Lightning flashed across the sky, briefly revealing the rushing river ahead. Mary's heart sank. The narrow crossing Josiah had hoped to use was completely flooded. The river had swelled into a violent current, dark water crashing against fallen branches and dragging debris downstream with terrifying force. Josiah pulled the horses to a halt beneath the trees, his mind racing as he studied the raging water. "We can still cross," he said, though uncertainty flickered across his face. Louise shook her head frantically. "That river will kill us!" Before Josiah could respond, the dog's howls exploded dangerously close behind them. Lantern light flickered through the trees as the guards closed the distance. Mary's breathing turned shallow as she realized they had run out of safe options. "If we stay here, they take us back," she whispered. Josiah nodded grimly. "And your mother will never give you another chance to leave." Another rifle shot rang through the forest, splintering bark from a nearby tree. Clara screamed as the horses reared in panic. "We cross now," Josiah said firmly.
He jumped down first, grabbing the lead rope while stepping into the freezing river. The current immediately slammed against his legs, nearly knocking him sideways. Mary helped Louise steady the younger sisters as Josiah guided the first horse into the rushing water. The cold struck like knives against their skin. The horses struggled to maintain balance as the river dragged against their bodies. Mary tightened her grip on the saddle, her arms aching as waves splashed over them. Halfway across, another gunshot cracked through the storm. The second horse stumbled, nearly throwing Clara and Evelyn into the water. Louise screamed as she struggled to hold them upright. Josiah lunged forward, grabbing the horse's bridle while fighting the current that threatened to drag them all under. "Don't let go," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. Behind them, lantern light reached the riverbank. Eleanor Whitfield stood among the guards, her cloak soaked and clinging to her frame as lightning illuminated her pale, furious expression. She watched silently as her daughters fought against the river, her eyes burning with obsession and betrayal. "Come back!" she screamed across the storm. "You belong to this family!" Mary turned briefly, tears mixing with rain as she saw her mother standing like a ghost against the lightning flashes. For a moment, guilt twisted through her chest. Then another violent surge of water slammed into them, snapping her attention back to survival. Josiah finally pulled the lead horse onto the opposite bank, collapsing to his knees as he dragged himself from the river. One by one, the sisters stumbled onto solid ground, soaked, shaking, but alive. Behind them, the guards hesitated at the flooded crossing. The current had grown too dangerous for their horses to follow safely. Eleanor stepped closer to the river's edge, staring across the raging water as her daughters disappeared into the dark forest beyond. Thunder cracked overhead as she stood motionless, her empire slipping through her fingers. On the far bank, Mary helped her sisters stand, while Josiah struggled to stay conscious, blood mixing with rainwater from a deep cut along his arm. "We can't stop," he whispered weakly. "They'll find another way around the river." Mary nodded, fear and determination battling inside her chest. Because escaping Whitfield Plantation wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of surviving what came next.
The exhausted fugitives seek shelter deep within the deadly swamps. As Josiah's injury worsens, the sisters face starvation and fear, and Eleanor launches one final hunt that will push everyone toward a tragic and unforgettable ending.
By dawn, the storm had weakened, but the danger had not. Mary and her sisters followed Josiah deeper into the Georgia swampland, their soaked clothes clinging heavily to their bodies as exhaustion slowed every step. The forest around them grew thicker, darker, and alive with unfamiliar sounds. Croaking frogs echoed through stagnant water pools, while distant birds screeched warnings from the treetops. The swamp offered protection, but it demanded a brutal price. Josiah staggered with each step, blood still seeping through the torn sleeve wrapped around his arm. The river crossing had nearly drained his strength, and the cold water had worsened the wound from the earlier gunshot graze. Mary noticed his pace slowing, her stomach tightening with fear. "You need to rest," she whispered, trying to support his weight. He shook his head stubbornly. "If I stop moving, they'll catch us. Your mother won't give up." The younger sister struggled to keep up. Clara's feet were raw and bleeding from hours of walking through mud and sharp roots. Evelyn leaned heavily against Louise, who fought her own trembling fatigue while trying to stay strong for the others. By midday, the group reached a narrow stretch of dry land surrounded by shallow swamp water. Moss-covered trees created a natural canopy, hiding them from open sky and distant view. Josiah finally collapsed against a fallen log, his breathing rough and uneven. Mary dropped beside him, panic rising as she examined his wound. The cloth wrapping had darkened with fresh blood. "We have to clean this," she said, her voice shaking. Louise hurried to gather rainwater pooled inside large leaves, while Mary carefully washed the wound. Josiah clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out as pain ripped through him. The younger sisters watched in silence, their fear growing with every passing minute. "What if he dies?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Mary froze, forcing herself to stay steady. "He won't. He can't." But deep down, uncertainty gnawed at her resolve.
As afternoon shadows stretched across the swamp, hunger began creeping into the group's fragile stability. None of them had eaten since the night before. Josiah tried explaining which berries were safe and where small fish sometimes gathered near shallow pools. The sisters struggled to collect anything edible, their delicate upbringing leaving them unprepared for survival in the wilderness. Meanwhile, miles away, Eleanor Whitfield refused to accept defeat. By sunrise, she had already organized a second search party. Local trackers were hired, men familiar with swamp trails and hidden river crossings. Eleanor rode at the front, her expression hollow but fueled by relentless determination. She refused food, refused rest, and ignored warnings about the swamp's dangers. "They cannot disappear," she told the men coldly. "That family belongs to me." Back in the swamp, Josiah's fever began rising as evening approached. His skin burned beneath Mary's touch, and his breathing grew shallow. She tried cooling his forehead with damp cloth, while Louise gathered moss to cushion him against the damp ground. "We might need to leave him here while we find help," Louise whispered reluctantly. Mary shook her head instantly. "We don't leave him, not after everything he's done." Josiah's eyes fluttered open briefly. "You might not have a choice," he murmured weakly. Mary grabbed his hand tightly. "We didn't survive the river just to lose you now." Suddenly, distant voices echoed faintly through the trees. The search party had reached the swamp. Mary's pulse thundered in her ears as she helped Josiah sit upright. The sisters froze, listening as dogs barked faintly in the distance. The hunters were closer than anyone had hoped or feared. Night began falling again, shadows swallowing the swamp in darkness as the fugitives prepared to move once more. But Josiah could barely stand, and the path ahead twisted deeper into terrain even locals avoided. Mary realized something terrifying in that moment. Escaping Whitfield Plantation only delayed the final confrontation, and the swamp might become their grave or their only chance at freedom. The haunting finale unfolds as Eleanor finally confronts her daughters in the swamp. Josiah makes a heartbreaking sacrifice, and the Whitfield legacy collapses in a tragic ending that leaves behind a chilling American legend.
If you want to witness the shocking conclusion and uncover how this dark chapter becomes one of Georgia's most disturbing forgotten stories, stay until the final part and don't forget to subscribe to Canon of Darkness for more untold historical mysteries. Night swallowed the Georgia swamp in suffocating darkness as Mary and her sisters struggled to move Josiah through the tangled forest. The air felt thick with moisture, insects buzzing relentlessly, while distant thunder rolled across the sky like a warning from something far older than the storm itself. Josiah's condition had worsened dramatically. Fever burned through his body, and his steps dragged heavily against the mud. Mary supported him as best she could, but she knew they were losing time and strength. Suddenly, barking exploded through the trees, louder than before. "They found us," whispered Louise, her voice breaking. Lantern lights flickered between the moss-covered trunks, growing closer with terrifying speed. The search party had finally tracked them into the swamp's deepest shadows. Mary's heart pounded as she scanned the surroundings. The narrow trail ahead led toward an abandoned logging dock near the river bend. Josiah had mentioned it earlier as a possible escape point where small fishing boats were sometimes hidden. "We keep moving," Mary said firmly, forcing confidence into her voice. Josiah grabbed her wrist weakly. "You take your sisters and run." Mary shook her head violently. "We don't leave you behind." Before he could respond, figures emerged through the trees. Eleanor Whitfield stepped forward, her soaked cloak dragging through swamp water, her pale face glowing under lightning flashes. Behind her stood guards and trackers holding rifles, their dogs snarling against their restraints. "It ends tonight," Eleanor called coldly, her voice slicing through the darkness. The sisters froze as their mother's silhouette approached slowly, her expression no longer human with grief or rage, only obsession remained. "You belong to your family. Everything I built was for you." Mary stepped forward, placing herself between her mother and her sisters. "You didn't build a family," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "You built a prison." Eleanor's eyes shifted toward Josiah, hatred burning inside them. "He poisoned you against your own blood." Josiah straightened, despite his weakening body. "They chose freedom," he said quietly.